Hello, I'm Tom Gosling, Executive Fellow at the European Corporate Governance Institute, and I'm here with Harald Walkate, founding partner of Route 17 and Senior Fellow at the Zurich Centre for Sustainable Finance and Private Wealth, to discuss the series that we co-authored, Does Sustainable Investing Work? Harold, it's great to talk to you about this, although we've obviously been talking about it a lot over recent months. But can you start explaining by explaining the origins of this project?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, thanks for having me. Just to start with, the origins of this project, it was a project that I actually did with Royal London Group. I think we also mentioned them in the article, so I think that's okay to mention here as well. Basically, what they asked me to do for them is to look at the academic research and also practitioner views, and to answer the question, what outcomes can we really attribute to sustainable investing? And then looking at this broadly in terms of values alignment, risk management, generating returns, but also and especially kind of investment approaches that really have real world outcomes or have impact, as we might say. And yeah, this led to some interesting findings. So realize that often academic studies focus on certain kinds of outcomes and impacts, but don't necessarily provide the full picture on what we're achieving. And so that led to the idea then to kind of delve into the academic research even further and also document some of these findings in these articles that we've now written together.
And the series is called Does Sustainable Investing Work?
Hmm.
But obviously, the whole area of sustainable investing is an area with many inconsistent definitions where the same terms mean different things to different people. So, what
Yeah.
is it that we mean by sustainable investing? And indeed, what is it that we mean by work?
Right. So first of all, sustainable investing is really kind of the broad toolbox of sustainable investing approaches. So that could be ESG integration, could be exclusions or divestment, could be engagement, it could be impact investing, which is in itself kind of a very broad area. But in selecting the academic papers, we really kind of looked at all of these different approaches that are collectively now often referred to as sustainable investing. In terms of the definition of work, what works. Obviously, it assumes we have clarity on the objectives here.
Hmm.
And so here also sustainable investing can have a lot of different objectives. We really focused on this one objective of resulting in real world outcomes. And so that's obviously what people typically refer to as impact these days. And so why did we choose that? Well, basically, it's kind of this observation that we've been on this collective journey over the last 20 years or so with thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of practitioners, companies, pension funds, insurance companies, asset managers, and so forth, all pursuing kind of this area. I guess our thinking was that surely it cannot only be to have better risk management as our objective, and also if we look at what brings a lot of people to this space and what's their motivation in going into ESG or sustainable investing, we find that often it is sort of this desire to somehow contribute to a better world. And then finally, also we just observe that a lot of people who buy ESG funds or sustainable funds, but also end investors or pension fund beneficiaries, often sort of assume that this way of investing allows them to make some sort of difference in the real world. And of course, that's also often what they are effectively promised when they buy these funds. Often there's sort of an explicit promise that this will allow you to have impact.
Hmm.
So when we talk about does sustainable investing work, we really interpret this especially as does it have some sort of outcome? Does it create some sort of change in the real world?
Hmm. And in that context, one of the things we do in the articles is introduce this sort of three-stage rocket analogy. And so, what is the rocket, and what's it got to do with sustainable investing?
Yeah, exactly. So, as said, often what we found also in this project is that often academic papers or academics look at sort of one stage in the chain of causality, so to speak. So they'll see if there has been some sort of link between their investor intervention and, for example, the cost of capital with a company. So what we then observed is that really, if we're talking about real world outcomes, there needs to be more than that direct effect, or that sort of directly observable effect. If we're talking again about climate change, and often, obviously in these articles and in our conversations, we'll use climate change as an example. Obviously, what we're really aiming for is, a reduction of emissions in the real world at a meaningful scale. And so what we wanted to do in applying this three-stage rocket analogy is really kind of look at different levels or different stages of impact. And so one of the studies that we also looked at early on that sort of prompted this idea was, there was a study that said that this was about the effect of investor exclusions, and the paper actually said the findings suggest that the impact of sustainable investors on a company's cost of capital can be substantial in many cases. Therefore, exclusionary screening and ESG integration can be effective tools for contributing to the ecological transition. So we thought that was maybe kind of an extrapolation, so to speak, of kind of this directly observable effect, the change in cost of capital, to actually making a contribution to the transition. Even though obviously the reader of this paper might reasonably conclude that, oh, apparently exclusions, excluding certain companies helps me contribute to the transition. And so then kind of these intermediary steps that also need to be satisfied for there, in fact, to be this contribution weren't really even studied or discussed in this particular paper. Anyway, so that's led us to this idea that really what we're looking for if sustainable investing is going to be effective is three different stages. One, there needs to be a certain direct effect. So for example, the cost of capital of the company goes up or down. Then there needs to be an indirect effect, which is that the company then changes its behavior as a result of that. And then there's a third effect, which is then at a systemic level, there needs to be some sort of outcome. For example, that's because the company reduces its emissions, the overall global emissions also go down. And so that's why we came up with this three-stage rocket analogy, because the three-stage rocket also has three stages, where each stage of the rocket has its own propulsion system. And then if you want to get into space, each stage of the rocket actually has to work.
One of the observations that we make is that, and you've already talked about today, is that a lot of the academic evidence focuses on whether there's a stage one effect or sometimes stage 1 and 2. So let's dig into that a little bit more, in a little bit more detail. What do we conclude about the stage 1 and stage 2 effects for common sustainable investing techniques?
Yeah, so well, we conclude that stage 1 effects actually work to some degree. So you can see in the academic literature that a number of sustainable investing practices have these direct effects. So for example, as we've been discussing, you'll see a change in the cost of capital or a change in share price. So you could argue that there's a change to the financial or non-financial incentives for managers and corporations. What we also see a lot is companies adopting policies or making certain commitments or setting targets as a result of sustainable investing practices. Also, often you see focus on the question of has the ESG rating for a company or a score changed? There is, in fact, it seems quite a bit of evidence that these stage 1 effects are occurring. Should be noted that the effects are often quite small. So going back to this idea of distinction between statistical and practical or economic significance, yes, there might be statistically significant outcomes, The question whether they're also economically significant is another one. And then also in terms of stage 2 effects, so there is also some evidence that that is happening as well. But there's not, it's not sizable, this evidence. So we're not seeing as much as we'd like that these stage 1 effects also lead to managers of companies changing their behavior. So for example, doing more good things or less bad things.
And one of the things that really struck me doing this was that, you know, you referred earlier to this sort of extrapolation effect, and often there's a study that shows something like, you know, engagement is effective in 50% of cases, and that might be true, but the objectives that have been achieved, as you say, are quite modest goals, such as achievement of, you know, disclosure objectives or relatively low hanging fruit, and that finding often gets extrapolated into this idea that engagement can help us solve the climate crisis, you know, put simply. So there's quite a big gap, isn't there, between what the evidence suggests around the power of some of these tools and what actually comes out at the other end.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's obviously also, so what we observe is that while investors can, in fact, you know, have influence in certain cases, we also just need to be aware of, or we need to be realistic about what companies can, in fact, do in the real world. And I think we'll talk about that, sort of this idea of limitations aware engagement and then the zone of discretion and so forth.
Yeah, I mean, well, just before we come on to that, I mean, even if there's been this sort of stage 1 and stage 2 effects, so the sustainable investing intervention has had some impact on something to do with the company. Company managers have responded to that impact and have changed something that the company does. So let's suppose that actually we've overcome those 2 hurdles. And actually, this is where a lot of the academic evidence focuses. Of course, what really matters is what happens at the system level, which brings us to this 3rd stage, which is whether those company level changes actually stick at a system level. What do we conclude here?
Right. So unfortunately, there we have to conclude that there is hardly any evidence to support this idea that sustainable investing practices are resulting in these meaningful systemic effects. So, for example, you know, this idea of emissions decreasing in an industry or companies contributing in an additional way to the Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs. So that doesn't mean that these effects are not occurring. It could also mean that they're just very difficult to measure. But so if we would try to think why might this be the case, it's also a question of externalities at the end of the day that we're often talking about. So externalities in these sort of economic systems are very difficult to overcome or to internalize, and are typically very costly for us as society, but therefore also costly for companies. So if we're asking companies to internalize these things, that is generally asking them to do something that is going to be very costly and perhaps not in their interest. Another reason why we might not be seeing these more systemic or stage 3 effects is that what is profitable tends to get done. So even if we might persuade one company to do less of some economic activity, if there's substantial demand, for example, for fossil fuels, and with demand for energy also still going up, it's extremely likely that this demand would just be picked up by some other company. So in that sense, as we also say in the articles, often these activities are a bit like squeezing a balloon. So you're kind of pushing down on a problem somewhere only for it to reappear somewhere else.
But I suppose a counterpoint to this view could be that just because there's an absence of evidence doesn't mean that there's an evidence of absence. I mean, couldn't it be that sustainable investing activity is having effects behind the scenes, perhaps building on this idea of field building as described in one of the review papers that we looked at by Emilio Marti and his co-authors?
Yeah. Yeah, no, that absolutely. That's certainly possible. And as said, this is also because it's often very difficult to measure these things or to substantiate these links and these effects through academic research. And I'd say in these situations, though, we'd still like to see a clear theory of change. You'd still like to just kind of apply common sense and figure out like how might this work, even if we can't sort of capture it very directly. And so Amelia also responded to one of the LinkedIn posts that we did on these articles, and offered this example, basically saying, there's apparently quite a lot of evidence that investor divestment campaigns can lead to sort of this influencing or changing of public perception, for example, about fossil fuel companies. And that could lead also to them changing their purchasing behavior or influencing how they vote in elections. And so that's all plausible, I suppose. I guess the question we have to ask ourselves is, how likely is it that that kind of behavior then really sort of leads to meaningful change in addressing the real blockers to climate action or removing externalities? And if we take, again, climate change as an example, the main blockers really appear to be kind of this, vast political power that carbon-dependent interests still have. And that goes way beyond, just energy companies lobbying. It's really more about, a broad set of industries that are still carbon-dependent. Another big blocker is kind of the economics of solutions like renewable energy, substitutes more generally to fossil fuels. And it doesn't seem very likely that then this kind of, influencing of public opinion is going to lead in a meaningful way to addressing these obstacles or these constraints. So I guess, in some, you'd still like there to be kind of this more sort of, cohesive, common sense narrative about how then, this kind of field building leads to the types of solutions or outcomes that we would like to see.
Having sounded a bit of a note of caution about what can be expected from sustainable investing, in the third article, we do highlight some areas where we think that investors can make a difference and where, therefore, investors who want to make an impact should focus their efforts. The first of these you've mentioned briefly already, which is limitations-aware engagement. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, first of all, engagement is in fact the one sustainable investing practice whose efficacy is very well documented in bringing about stage 1 and 2 effects, and especially this applies especially for collaborative engagement. And also just more generally, I guess I'd point out that we're obviously a little bit sort of critical, maybe even skeptical in these articles, but at the same time, I would say that we're also making progress in really sort of seeing which practices can work and then learning in which situations we can put them to work. So here again, for engagement, as you say, we've come up with this idea of limitations-aware engagement, and so it means effectively that it's a more realistic approach to engagement, or realistic in the sense that the investor needs to have realistic expectations as to what you can achieve. It's also linked to this idea that for many of the externalities that we're trying to address, there are going to be winners and losers. And so we just have to observe that it's going to be incredibly difficult, even though engagement can be sort of a very effective tool, it's going to be very difficult to persuade companies to do things that go against their commercial interests, especially if we're sort of expecting them to put themselves out of business altogether, or undertake economic activity that is radically different from what they might be doing today, and where the economics might be much less attractive. And so another concept that is linked to all of this thinking is this idea of zone of discretion. So you really want to be thinking about, as an investor, about what is within the zone of discretion for a particular company. So where do they have agency? Where can they act? And where are they willing to act? And so if you think about this in the context of the SDGs, for example, there's often this thinking that any pharmaceutical company is a healthcare company. And so anything that a pharmaceutical company does contributes to SDG 3, which is the health sustainable development goal. But if you kind of look at the text of the UN resolution and you look at all the goals and sub-goals that are listed there, you kind of have to conclude that a lot of what's mentioned there is not likely to be in the zone of discretion of a typical pharmaceutical company or healthcare company, simply because the economic incentives may not be there for them to become active in these areas.
That brings us on to this idea that getting the right policy framework, the right economic incentives is clearly critical to many of the sustainability challenges that we face. And so an area that is coming up the agenda is policy advocacy and action on corporate lobbying. What do we envisage in that area?
Yeah, right. So the thinking here is that addressing many, if not all, systemic issues is also going to require some form of government action or public policy. So there could be taxes or subsidies or laws or regulations. And so if the point is for the investor to really contribute to these solutions, then stands to reason that then creating the circumstances where these effective, public policy measures can be implemented should also be in the toolbox, so to speak. And so, none of this is to argue then that the private sector has no role, but it's really going to be more of a question of public and private sector collaborating, or the private sector helping to create the kinds of circumstances where this effective public policy can in fact be created and implemented. And actually, this is also something a lot of the publications or a lot of the papers that we reviewed also point this out. Sometimes it's more kind of in a footnote or as an afterthought, where it will be stated, well, of course, we also need public policy. But in this paper, we zoom in on the role of the investor. But so that's also something that we'd just like to elevate a little bit more and highlight to investors. If you want to make a contribution, then this should definitely be in the toolbox that you're going to consider.
And so then the third area we talk about is genuinely additional impact investments, whether that's in private markets, venture capital, or blended finance. And why do we draw a distinction between these types of activities and public markets, which is where actually most sustainable investing activity, certainly by AUM, takes place?
Yeah. Right. So that's one of the challenges also in this project. Most of the relevant academic research looks at activity in public markets, also because that's where kind of the most data is. However, if we think about the concept of additionality, so how much change can you affect as investor, you're much more likely to have this or find this additionality in private markets than in public markets. And this is because often if it's about raising primary capital, that's something that typically happens in private markets, and their investors will be in a position to allocate capital to companies or decide not to allocate capital. And that decision is going to be much more meaningful, or it's going to have much more effect in the sense that you're really allowing a company to undertake impactful activity, for example. Whereas in public markets, typically, you have much less influence as an investor because you're buying and selling decisions don't really result in additional capital going into these companies. You're basically just giving capital to whoever is selling you the shares. Similar reasoning applies to the engagement side. So typically private sector companies are sort of closely held. So the investor is likely to have much more influence than with large listed companies where the investors typically have a much smaller position. Yeah, in terms of the blended finance, that's really sort of the idea is somewhat linked there. Typically, companies looking for capital who want to implement solutions to, for example, climate change or sustainable development goals, often will run into this challenge that this activity is not yet considered investable by private sector investors, especially pension funds and insurance companies who typically have strict investment criteria. So then the idea is that you can work also with public investors or philanthropic investors, and in that way change the risk return profile of your investment. And so here again, if investors really want to invest in an additional way, have impact in an additional way, but they still also want to meet their risk return requirements, then blended finance solutions can really be brought to bear to de-risk these investments, and that will still allow them to make these investments.
So we've set out to take an evidence-based approach to looking what does and doesn't work, but it could be argued that our final recommendations where investors should focus aren't fully backed up by rigorous research papers that prove causalities. How would you counter that?
Well, I would say, I mean, that's fair criticism because, unfortunately, there is a lot that is simply not covered by the academic research. And, some of it may never be covered. And so as we were just discussing, what I think we need to do is simply apply common sense and rigorous thinking. Also, what I'd point out is that there's something that we'd like to see more of in the sustainable investing space is leaning more on other academic disciplines, because there is quite a lot that is not covered by the sustainable investing literature, but might be covered in the more general sort of economics literature, engineering, development finance, political science, and so forth. So I think if you look at sort of this bigger body of evidence, often you realize that we as societies do in fact know how we can solve these problems, and we also often know very well what the blockers and the constraints are. And so I think there it's just then the question of assessing where can finance and investments really play a role. And also we have to be honest that sometimes finance and investments cannot play a very large role. But where they can, for example, through engagement or through blended finance, through private markets, basically we just have to be very clear about what our theory of change is and what our role of investors is. And then I think where we conclude that finance or investors cannot play a large role, we could probably still make a contribution, but then it's more by helping create the right circumstances that would enable the outcomes that we'd like to see. For example, contributing to this public policy as we were just discussing.
Well, Harald, it's been a load of fun doing this project with you. And for our viewers and listeners, this is the first in a series of interviews with academics and market practitioners to get their views on this question of does sustainable investing work? And if so, in what circumstances? So please do join in the debate. If you head to ECGI.global website, search for does sustainable investing work, you can read the articles, submit your own comments and views, or engage with the posts that Harald and I have been putting on LinkedIn on this topic, and there'll be further links to these items in the show notes. So Harald, thank you very much.
Thanks, Tom. It was a pleasure.